Well, if it isn't my old friend Dean Bagley.
Welcome back, Kevin.
Yep, another week of asynchrony here, and as we like to explore how we're seeing the world in very different ways, and trying to find some truth between us. Last week we were talking about identity and how that affects us, affects our decisions, and specifically affects our political opinions, right, and how we react to news, information, anything that we interact with, um, and also how we interact with people, right? And being able to identify and kind of find our group associations. And I think that's kind of where we left off, right? We were talking a little bit about we talked a lot about personal identity and how that affects us as individuals, but it is really intricately intertwined with groups and group association, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, kind of to rephrase that a little bit. Yeah, I one of the areas of thought that I've considered looking into that is, the differences, I had identified last time kind of looking at assumed identity versus assigned identity. And another vector on that is like individual identity versus group identity.
Right, right. And I mean, without getting into too many specifics of direct topics, one of the things that seems to be very prevalent these days, especially in politics in America, at least, is whether or not you are part of this movement that we've people call MAGA, right? And whether or not you are, and that has become, in a sense, an identity for a lot of people, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I I have a take on that, which you might find interesting, which is kind of relevant to stuff that we've been seeing going on recently.
Hmm.
Um, I've never considered myself like directly MAGA, but I'm like MAGA adjacent. I thought it would be worth revisiting at some point, and this seems like a good time. Um, I hijacked the initial conversation and kind of went through my initial development in looking at this in our first episode.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things that I'd thought about is I wanted to point out, you know, my associational development through that because I started off with an association with the Tea Party movement.
Hmm.
And I
Yep.
actually attended a protest there at the Capitol in Anderson because I was still in Indiana at the time. Um, Tax day on 2010, which I just kind of went and stood out there, and that's my personal experience with political protests.
Hmm.
But um, my belief on kind of where that was coming from, at least for me, was the identification with there's a power structure currently in place, whatever that's made up of, whatever that looks like, that I don't really like what they're doing. So I'd like to see someone go in and shake up the power structure. That's kind of what that meant to me. Um,
Well, I mean, when you use the when you call it the Tea Party, right? I mean, that was a disruptive event, right? The original Tea Party, I mean, it was obviously a disruptive event, something to kind of, throw a wrench in things.
yeah, and it's the 2010 movement is taxed enough already. Um, but it was like it was kind of a libertarian leaning against government overreach, that type of thing. Um, which honestly had a strong mirror around the similar time in the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Right. Sure.
Um, it's a common theme that people have recognized that, and I mean, this is something that I think we would both agree on is that we see this in the political class that they have been, um, you know, in service to the donor class.
Right. Right.
And so now they're not representing the interests of you and I, they're representing the interests of the donors. And I think both Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement were in response to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting because both have very strong kind of individual freedom aspects to the group association, don't they?
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you'd look at, because I see a lot of people talking about, I've seen Occupy Wall Street mentioned a lot recently, and I've seen people talk about the Tea Party movement that were part of it back in the day. Um, One of the things that happened with both of those, which is interesting, is that they were hijacked by the political establishment. The Occupy Wall Street movement was incorporated into the Democratic Party. The Tea Party movement was incorporated into the Republican Party.
Right. Right. Actually, I would say more specifically, integrated, each of them integrated into the more radical elements of each party, right? Or more aggressive elements. I
Well,
mean, because
I
like, it's in on the left, it was represented by people like Bernie Sanders and AOC and really what we call the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but I mean, what I think happened with that is you had, those movements represented more of, the extreme wing loosely associated to either party. And I think what happened is that both movements were co-opted by the establishment
Mm,
of either party.
hmm hmm
Once you had mainstream Republican candidates, from my perspective, that were adopting the Tea Party mantle, it was, it was LARPing. It was, performance. They were just adopting whatever they could to garner more support. And I would venture to say that the same thing happened on the left.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, there were certainly people within the Democratic Party that were uncomfortable with the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street crowd in the party. But I think what happened, I don't know if it got, the funny thing about the Democrats and the Democratic Party in particular is that, it's I don't think it's ever been as uniform. It doesn't seem to me to be as uniform on the left as it does on the right. I mean, is that an unfair characterization?
Yes and no. Um, let me there are a bunch of people that I've been watching recently that have made this point, and I think you'll find this interesting. Um, they have made the point that it's portrayed on both sides that the party that you're opposed to is a whole lot more unified than yours is.
Hmm, okay.
So your point is absolutely correct, and that's the perception that we're given.
Mhm,
Now, where I would push back on that a little bit, I know I had shared a while ago with you. There was a piece of research that I had seen that was floating around being referenced. The part of it included a picture which showed it was like kind of a plot point kind of thing, you know, amoeba like, which showed the difference of opinion on various, s- you know, subjects and plot points on the right versus on the left. And it showed the left being a whole lot more consolidated on those than what the right was. Do you remember that?
vaguely, yeah, but, I found that kind of surprising, frankly, because, my perception would have been that it would have been the opposite.
Right. And, like I said, that goes back to the previous point that that's the perception that we're given
Mhm,
is that the other party is a whole lot more unified, or the other side is a whole lot more unified than what we're looking at. Because, I mean, people are aware of their own ecosystem. And so they're aware of differences of opinion. You know, you you may see a big difference between, Bernie AOC and Nancy Pelosi and maybe even other factions in what the Democrats or the left are looking at. Whereas, somebody who's more on the right wouldn't see that. But then, I think you're also aware that there's a huge division on what we would consider the right now between like the Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens wing versus, kind of what would have been like the Mitch McConnell wing, which was the, establishment Republican Party. You've got the Christian nationalist movement. You've got Nick Fuentes. There's a bunch of different areas, and I think that's one of the issues that we have is because from the perspective of somebody outside of that, this is one of the things that I've found frustrating. What I'm seeing is that there's a lot of reaction from people who are not on the, would not consider themselves on the right, probably do consider themselves on the left, that there's a lot of feeling that there's absolutely no difference between Nick Fuentes and Charlie Kirk.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, I mean, I think all of us recognize that when we use the term MAGA, for example, I mean, it is in a sense, I mean, it is a coalition, right?
Yeah.
It's certainly not an homogenous group. Um,
So
that's for sure.
the point that I wanted to make with that, which is why I went back to the Tea Party thing, I want to answer a question that you said your wife had,
Hmm.
which is, how can I vote for Trump?
Right.
So the reason that I voted for Trump is because I saw him, I saw the the political, the representatives of the political Democratic Party, regardless of what they say and what they support, predominantly represent the interests of the overall establishment ruling class. And I definitely see
The
that on.
economic elite, I think you're talking about, right?
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it's different ways that we want to characterize that, but yeah, the economic elite, and the Republican Party definitely represents that as well.
Right.
And through our primary process, which I know you have major problems with, we end up with this situation, that The Simpsons showed us, where you had your choice between the one alien and the other alien, and they're both going to eat you.
Right. Right.
Um, So that's basically what our elections come down to. So there's no choice. So for me, you know, I understand all of the objections. Some of them I think are absolutely valid. Some I think are, narrative and characterization. But Trump to me represented the only chance that we have really of somebody from outside coming in and potentially being able to shake up that system that's in place.
Right. And we don't have to get into whether or not he has played, played through truly to that or not. But in a sense, don't you think that that also plays on what one of the things that you've brought up many times in these various conversations, and that is that very often we are defined not necessarily by our own group or by our own set of values, but what group we're not a member of, right? I mean, the other, right? We're defined by what we're not as much or more than what we are.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that I had pointed out in one of our conversations that really seemed to resonate with you. That a lot of times group membership is defined by saying you're not part of us.
Right. Right. And one of the things that you just highlighted a few minutes ago was the fact that a lot of us are not happy with whatever establishment parties there are right now in general, right? I mean, I'm not very happy with the Democratic Party, although I define myself more aligned with them, not necessarily because I want to be a part of the Democratic Party, but just because I don't want to be defined as the alternative. Right.
Right. And I think that's very strong at this point. And as that partisan political identity category has become kind of the overarching category that everybody needs to be a part of, and especially given the fact that in our country there's only two, really. And I know people want to raise the point that, oh, well, it would be better if we had a system more like Canada or the UK, or where we had more parties and everything. If you look at it, they really still only have two sides.
Yeah. I mean, things do come down whatever topic you're talking about, very often it will crystallize into an A or B option, right?
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the things that I look at when, looking specifically at the category of identity is that, I think what I had said was that, um, you know, groups tend to define themselves by who they're opposed to. And I believe my personal feeling is that that is always going to be the case. So, regardless of how diverse a group you can assemble and how much, homogeneity you can get in that diversity, that group is only going to mean anything if they've got another group that they say that we're not them.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it's going to establish itself and protect itself by enforcing that, right? And kind of validating that.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at history on that and, you look at, call whatever identity category that you want. You can look at the history of racism or misogyny or, whatever on that. But if you eliminate that aspect of it, like the English and the French were trying to kill each other for 100 years. And
Longer than that, actually.
well, I mean, they had a specific
Oh, they spent
war
a
that was
hundred
a
years
hundred.
war. That's yeah.
Yeah. So that's a century of hatred at that
Hmm.
point. And, basically what you're looking at is okay, they speak a different language. I mean, ethnically, they were pretty much the same people, especially after the Norman conquest and that type of thing. And you can find that anywhere. I mean, you can find, wars based on ethnic division, but then you've got the Irish, and it's like, if we're the same, if we speak the same language with the same dialect, whatever it's, well, I'm going to kill you for your hair color.
It's interesting to me because I was listening to a podcast with two of my favorite conservative Davids, David Frum and David um, Brooks, and who write for the Atlantic. But David Brooks was on David Frum's podcast recently, and they were talking about this, and it made me think about identity and the groups that we're associated with when they were talking about the neoconservative movement and how that actually came out of intellectual liberals, right? That kind of a liberal in the kind of the classical sense of the word, right? Um,
I think you could take it a step further than that. I was fascinated to learn recently. I never would have expected this. The original neocons were Trotskyites.
they absolutely were. Yep, they were the Trotskyite communists that kind of in New York and it's the schools where as opposed to the Stalinists, right? That was the other group, right? The Stalinists were the
That was,
heavy-handed, fists down on the table kind of, authoritarians. The
I think
Trotskyites were
initially it was,
the intellectual communists,
I think it was Lenin and Trotsky at the time. But yeah, that, the Leninites eventually became the
the
Stalinites.
Stalinists.
And,
Yeah.
but, so those are the two wings of the communists.
Yeah. Right. And they became the neocon. Right.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, but
and
they became that though because they got disillusioned with this idea of being able to kind of tie everything up into neat, solutions and kind of um, policy wonk our way out of social problems, right?
yeah.
So but the reason why I brought that up is because when we look at the groups that we're associated with, and that becomes a part of our personal identity, right? It makes it very difficult a lot of times to really be able to think critically about issues because it's a lens, right, that you look through, and it shapes and forms what you see. With that looking through that lens of the group association.
Yeah. We had talked last time about, you know, you had introduced me to the book that you were reading. on fast and slow thinking,
Hmm.
and that really resonated in this context as far as the system one snap decision thinking versus the system two critical analysis thinking. And I feel like identity is a category which has that ability to hook into system one thinking to somewhat fairly, because for our own personal identity, we've done a lot of system two thinking into what are our values, what are our beliefs, that type of thing. And then I feel like that, from that we create an avatar that we then use within that group identity. Um, and I think, you know, parallel to what we were saying about how we're looking at, the opposing group being a whole lot more unified. Um, I think we have a tendency, until we run into some disagreement, to assume that everybody who is in our group identity looks at things the way that we do.
Yes, and it can be actually quite jarring when that doesn't pan out to be the case.
Right. So if somebody on the outside, for whatever reason, is trying to provoke a response based on that group identity classification, that's real easy to hook. And the other vector that I've thought of on that, where I feel like that applies, is that it also hooks into emotion, which is part of that system one thinking. And that's somewhat based on that moral value judgment that is part of our in group, out group thinking.
Exactly. We talked about the value judgment being the that kind of immediate reflex, um, heuristic, right? That shortcut to just kind of associating somebody with an entire an entire set of beliefs, right? An entire, kind of defining them as X.
Yeah, it's shortcuts all the way down. You've got somebody, and the more closely you associate who you are with that group identity, the the stronger that triggering is.
Right. Absolutely. And the stronger that partisanship is, right?
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
I was telling you earlier in the week, I mean, I recognize this in myself, going back to what I was talking about um last week with the story, somewhat silly in the face of it, of, how the personal identity that I had that was most important to me in my 20s was, as far as being the music I listened to and who I thought of at that point. And it has struck me that, you know, and I think this is true for people to some extent across the board, is that is the era that we solidify that identity that we have of who we think we are.
Hmm.
Um, but I have realized the strength of this in the fact that if something touches me on one of those exposed connections on that identity 35 years later at this point, there is no rational thought for me whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. When we one of the I was also talking about this with my wife recently, where I would like to believe that when something is presented to me, some kind of information or a topic or an issue, or I see an event, that how I evaluate that is based first on my values, my personal values and my morals and my ethics and what I believe to be right and true, right? And then
Uh-huh.
that informs my political thinking as far as my group participation or my group association, or am I Democrat, am I Republican, whatever, am I libertarian, conservative, liberal, whatever, right? However, one of the things that I've realized in our conversations, and I've had to kind of be honest with myself to some extent, is that I'm not sure that I can say that with 100% confidence. I don't know how somebody can actually be sure that they're being really informed and their political opinions are being informed by their values and not the other way around.
Well, let me say two things on that. And one's going to be a challenge, and one's going to be giving you the benefit of the doubt that you can take back to your wife on that. Um, the challenge is, and I mean, I had said something online last week. I am struck by the fact that looking at the posts that you make routinely on Facebook, um, they all come across as being heavily informed by your partisan political identity. So I do feel like that is where you operate from. And one of my hopes in this conversation is that we can break you out of that a little bit. Um, and I mean, it's not a value judgment, and it's not to say that I think I'm any better than anybody else, but I think that, the world will benefit if we can all break ourselves out of that a little bit. So,
Well, it's yeah, I mean, I would agree with you in principle on that. However, I will say there's a psych I'm trying to remember what her name. Oh, Emily Falk is her name, and she is a psychologist at Penn, University of Pennsylvania.
mhm.
And one of the things that she talks about that's very very interesting is that when you ask people, that as far as what informs their political thinking, it's basically it's their values. They say everybody says that it's the basically 90% of all people believe that their political opinions are based on their values.
Well, that's what I was going to say in my
We all
second
believe
point.
that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say in my second point, and this is in your defense. Developing that identity, it's the point that I made before. Developing our political identity, we have done a lot of system two thinking to be able to come to that. So we initially assumed our political identity based on our values and our principles and our beliefs and how we think about things. So, all of that stems from having done the work at at that point. Um, and, that was my thinking on that. And that corresponds directly to what you just said, with what survey results have borne out is that, we feel like we have our political opinion because we've done that thinking based on values and that type of thing. The problem is, again, what I feel like we're seeing now in the division, and it's probably only because we're seeing the amount of division on this vector that we're seeing at this point. I'm kind of looking at, well, we had done that, but now there are a lot of people, and for me, again, it goes back to being able to be hooked by that to support a position. Is it that it's a trigger to be able to flip us into that system one thinking where we're not considering every aspect of everything that we're seeing. It's being provided to us based on the context of our political identity, the other people's political identity, which triggers into that, you know, morality judgment. These people are right, these people are wrong. This is the side that I want to be on.
Well, it also becomes a handle that people can use to manipulate groups as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. I
because
mean, that's,
if you can get people I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting, and you hear this from people on the left all the time, is why trying to figure out why people will vote for what they perceive as a party that is not in their own best economic interest, for example, right? And one of the ways you can get somebody to do that is if you can trigger them emotionally on a cultural issue, right?
yeah.
And be able to manipulate them that way, as opposed to allowing them to see their similarities, see the things that
Yeah.
they
And,
actually have in
it's
common.
that emotional moral judgment. If you hook somebody into looking at it that way, you can get them to support whatever position that you're giving them.
Right, exactly. But because the funny thing is that one of the other things that they found that this psychologist at Penn found was that when you list out all of the values that people say they hold as important values, most of them we have a pretty strong uh, shared appreciation of those values, right? Most of the
Right.
values we actually agree on by and large.
No, I mean, that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this, because we recognize that we have shared values, we have shared perspective, and have more in common that we have in opposition, and yet we find ourselves on opposing sides of like every argument.
Right. Right. I mean, we both believe highly in truth and honesty, right?
Yeah.
We both believe in the rule of law. I mean, we believe that that's important for society to have rules and have laws that people obey, right?
Yeah, and
We
I think
There's
that
a
the
lot of
diff
these values that we agree on.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that we've identified in our conversations, I feel like one of the things that we have that is the reason that we're not seeing more of this going on is that we both realized that the other person is, we're both coming into this in good faith with an honest desire to explore and find truth, and we both realized and acknowledged that the other person is also coming into this in good faith with an interest in finding truth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I found interesting about that study when I was reading about the different values and things is that we do share many of these values, and we both and both sides value them highly. However, we do tend to rank them differently, right? We do tend to kind of put different priorities, maybe in a different ranking system than rather than not necessarily disagreeing on those values. We just maybe prioritize them a little bit different. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yeah, I have seen research on that as well that indicates the same thing.
But I mean, like, one of the things that I found interesting is the thing that people on the left, the value that in their list of values anyway, that people on the left found the most important to them, for example, was global cooperation. And that was the thing that was the most disagreed upon as far as value, as far as ranking the value. But even on the right side, those people who didn't rank it as highly, there's still almost 70% of people said that was a very, very important value, right? So, I mean, it's like even those things that we differ the most on, we still, by and large, a majority of us agree.
Yeah, and of course you can get into with that. I've seen a lot of stuff also being somewhat critical of polling because a lot of the results that you get depend on how you ask the question.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also how you trigger those group identity association,
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can do that. You can manipulate that with how you ask the question. It's
especially with catchwords. You
yeah,
know? Yeah, I mean, you use words like defunding or, those kind of things, and or restriction, or there's all kinds of trigger words that have been used, racism is one, obviously, that trigger people into their camps, right? And basically force them back into their camp.
yeah. I was thinking about that concept last week. I started to write something on it and haven't finished it, but the idea that we have magic words.
Mhm.
And if you say the magic word, you instantly, set people into and yeah, it's, racism, sexism, blank phobia, whatever that is, you want to say, but also socialism, communism, fascism, those are all magic words that you can throw out and, instantly groups align.
Right, exactly. And people kind of just fall right back into their camps.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I've recognized in myself too. I mean, talking about the, music identity, but being a child of the 80s, I grew up very anti-communist.
Mhm.
The USSR were our enemies. We were, that was messaging that was repeated all the time every day. So I have realized that I still strongly suffer from, if anything is then tagged with a description of socialist or communist or collectivist, or that triggers me into that system one thinking, and I recognize that.
Right. Yeah. And it also allows for that manipulation of basically forcing people into, certain positions.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that relates to historically, for example, is in our generation, we've seen the political polarization tied to religion more than it probably has been in the past in history. And one of those things is tied to this constant drumbeat of anti-communism, anti-socialism, and that got conflated somehow along the way with religion, right? I mean, that's why we inserted in the 1950s, why Eisenhower inserted the words "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Because they really wanted to establish we are not the godless communists, right? Because we were in the heat of this, battle in the 1950s, especially with the Red Scare and everything.
And I would not disagree with that, but I've also been thinking about that in the context of, defining the overarching group identity. You know,
Right.
the
Well,
the
that's kind of where I'm getting at.
identities,
What I'm getting at. Yeah.
yeah, the identities that we're divided on now are the partisan political identities. In other times, that has been more religious. And, I mean, if you look at the history of the church, back when the Catholic Church was the only church, that was the us group identity. And,
Right.
you know, anybody, anybody that was set up to be someone that you were going to be opposed to, that was the characterization that you gave them.
Right. Right.
And yeah, even in our recent history, you look back to the 80s and the satanic panic, it was, it was very recently that we were still doing that, as that, the communist, um, example that you give there, or, other examples of, the godless or the demonic, or, that type of thing. Those were characterizations that you made when you wanted to create opposition.
Right.
Um,
Right. But don't you see that as, I mean, that is a big uh, distinguishing differentiation, right, between the right and the left in America today, right now, is that association with one side being more towards religious, you know, than the other side, basically. Because I mean, that's what I mean. One of the things that we hear on the left all the time is that the left is the godless atheist, right? Yeah. And of course, that's vastly overgeneralization. I mean, I don't even know if there that you can even say that there are more atheists on the left than the right. I don't know, but it certainly is the one of the defining characteristics that pushes people into certain groups. I mean, I don't want to be a Democrat because I don't want to be associate with those godless heathens.
well, it's interesting how that's evolved, because you had individuals like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden who are both Catholic.
Right,
I mean, JFK was Catholic, and that was a
right,
huge deal at that point.
right. Sure,
Because there was a big question of, was he then going to be subservient to the Pope? Is he not going to be the leader of the free world? That there was an issue with that. But
and we all
you
know Obama was Muslim, right? So
yeah, whatever. You know, there's a whole lot of different
being
directions that you
facetious,
could
of
take
course.
that in. But yeah, I get your point. But It w what I was gonna say is that I find it interesting that it wasn't that long ago, 20, 30, 40 years, that you had as strong an association with different aspects of Christianity with the Democratic Party as you did with the Republican Party. That wasn't a divisive thing. Whereas I agree with you that now that's a big differentiation, fair or not, um, between the parties. And this plays into something else that has kind of been, you know part of what I have personally identified to myself as part of my analysis as to where I'm looking at patterns, um, and kind of being able to pull the context out of the pattern to be able to see how the pattern applies in different contexts.
Mhm, mhm.
The example of what we had talked about with how that's how science fiction works,
Right,
is that, you can identify like the pattern of a topic without the baggage that comes along with it.
right.
And what I see in that, religion, I mean, it's its own thing, but I also see that as a recurring pattern of just finding ways to differentiate between us and them and making that moral judgment. Now, that's interesting. Throughout the history of America, America was founded on, Judeo-Christian beliefs. So the idea of, you know, affiliating with those beliefs was commonly accepted regardless of what political party that you were on. That was fine. To whereas now it's been sharpened a lot more to, you know, almost what they were doing with Kennedy is like, is that clouding your thinking? Is that clouding your judgment? Is your analysis based on, this belief system that you have that, for certain people, you know, some people accept as, well, this is the way you have to see things. And some people think, wow, that's crazy. And you can apply that both ways.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, we can get into the whole argument of just how much the United States was based on Judeo-Christian beliefs, but at the at the core of it, though, too, was that they didn't want to make the mistakes of the years of the centuries of violence and fighting that religion caused in Europe, right? I mean, they definitely wanted to avoid that, and so, and that's where our separation of church and state comes from.
Well, and that reminds me of another point on this that I was going to make, going back to the whole concept of like individual versus group identity.
Mhm.
Um, feel like one of the things that I've observed on that is that kind of the larger the group, the more ideology and morality and all of that gets stripped out of the actual function of the group. Um, like you said, for the individual, your values and principles very much shape your group identity. But the larger the group gets, the more the function of the group is to promote the interests of the group. And I feel like my suspicion is that that's related to Dunbar's number.
Yeah,
Um,
we
we
talked
talked
about that a
about
little bit.
that,
Mhm.
and you were thinking about that in the context of, oh, there's like 150 people that I can maintain personal relationships with. Where I thought that is really applicable is not looking at it that way, but looking at, there's about 150 people or whatever number you want to look at that the leader of a group can have a personal relationship with in the group. So for a group that size and under, all of the members of the group are seen as individuals and are able to be considered their individual needs and that type of thing. That's why you find working for a smaller company, the owner of the company is a lot more considerate of the personal needs of the employees. There's a lot of different consideration, more than just, showing up, doing your job, whatever. And the larger the organization grows outside of that, the more that people work there are just cogs in the machine.
Right. But I mean, so if we want to find a way to get along, right, with different people with different rankings of their value priorities, with different, strengths of feeling about certain issues and things, and if we do want to get along in a way that, because I think group and what when we get to identity at a national level, it is important in order to keep harmony, right? To have some level of we are all one in a sense, at some level at least, right?
Yeah,
I
I mean,
mean,
that was
I
the
think we can agree that that's a beneficial thing.
that was the ideal of the American melting pot that we,
Right,
e pluribus unum.
right,
Um,
exactly.
we
Out of
all
many,
come
one.
together and become one body. And that's
Right,
yeah, that's the ideal for all of that. And I mean, again, national identity is another group identity. And that's something that we've been able to get people to agree with strongly enough that they're willing to go die in defense of that and kill other people in defense of that.
right, right,
And we can evaluate the morality of that, but it, that's definitely been the case.
right. Well, I mean, we know this from our own personal experience right now. And what we're doing today and what we're doing in this podcast is basically one of those steps to finding that type of harmony, right? You mean you have to have a dialogue first and foremost, do you not? I mean, that's where you got to start somewhere,
Yeah.
right? And I think then that means that we go into it with the idea that we are going to try to reduce in-group favoritism and reduce out-group discrimination, right? And
For for me, what I feel like would be the answer to that would be, the same thing that I heard, when I was much younger, and the consideration of, looking at things in terms of race is you evaluate the individual based on their own beliefs and their own characteristics instead of assigning them an identity based on what you believe their identity to be.
right, because they're not part of your group or you've
Right.
already determined that they're not part of your group.
Yeah, let me see if I can condense kind of what I'm thinking there a little bit. So I feel like we've got our own individual identities that we determine, and then we sign on to a group identity, and I feel like we kind of shortcut that to making the assumption most of the time anyway, unless we're jarred out of it, that everybody in that group identity that we all consider ourselves part of have the same or similar values. Um, And then the group identity defines the outgroup identity of others and assigns what, you know, that outgroup or that in group believes that outgroup's values to be.
Right, right.
And
Highlighting
that,
the differences.
yeah. So, I mean, if you look at that in the racial context, that would explain, the racial prejudice of the early part of our history to where, you know, we as white people viewed others as black people as being the other with a set of identity categories that we believed that these people held, largely based on the fact that we had had no real personal interaction with individual members of this group as we saw it. And we've seen how that can break down with the efforts of I don't remember the guy's name, Daryl something. Um, but there's a guy who's he's a black jazz blues musician
Mhm.
that has made a campaign over the last few decades of getting to know on a personal level members of the KKK. And he's got, 2 dozen sets of robes at this point that people have gotten to know him, announced the organization, and given him, their vestments because they realized that the judgments they were making didn't apply to actual people.
Right, right. And, that's interesting because sometimes those efforts to manipulate, cross lines that kinda destroy the intent that they're trying to do. I warned you a little bit that I was gonna throw you a little bit of a curveball, uh, during our conversation this week, and here it comes. One of the things, we don't really talk a lot about current events on on this podcast, and we don't do it on purpose because we want to look at these issues from a higher vantage point, right? And I don't mean higher in terms of morally or ethically higher. I mean just from a view of 30,000 feet as opposed to at the molecular level, right?
Yeah, I mean, we had said that we
And
wanted to, spend the early part of the podcast establishing kind of an analytical model to be able to look at things, lay down some foundational principles, and just logistically, we wanted to get some stuff in the can. So, for our audience, we're recording this. It's not going to be available for public consumption for 6 weeks. This is
right.
our sixth episode. We haven't released one yet. We released the first one next week.
Yeah, exactly. So, one of the things that in recent events that I found very interesting, and this will be the true 10 years from now, uh, even when the furor and the motions are not as raw and on the surface. But for example, the recent shooting of Alex Preddy in Minneapolis, for example, something came out of that I found very interesting, directly related to our conversation here, and that is that as the narrative started to come out and the administration tried to put their spin on it and tried to use it for their own political, as any administration would do, as any politician would do on either side of the aisle, and try to make it work best for them, they highlighted the fact that he had a gun on him and made that into a bad thing or a reason for what was happening. Now, I'm not going to get into the right or wrong of that, but I found it interesting that that got immediate pushback from part of their MAGA coalition that were the Second Amendment folks, people that really had that as a high priority, topic that was important to them. And I wonder how much of that was a a disconnect of what they thought in their mind as the identity of the group, and all of a sudden their group was saying something that clashed with their understanding of the group's identity.
Well, that goes back to what I was saying, where I feel like at a macro level, group identity is somewhat divorced from principles. I mean, that's one of the things that I was uneasy with coming into this, that I was trying to figure out in the analysis that I've been doing for the last few years, is the fact that I felt like um, the portrayal of the right and left doesn't correspond to the reality.
Right.
The categories that were given, and I mean, you can look at that, even identifying for yourself as a person of the left, what that means to you doesn't necessarily correspond to the way that's presented in the public conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this is an example of that on the right. I mean, the right is very pro Second Amendment. And, when you're saying, well, you just shouldn't be carrying a gun, it's like, whoa, 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 wait a
Whoa,
minute.
exactly. Yeah, because
Now,
that
there
does
were,
go direct, because within that group, that is one of those characteristics that people have used to self-identify, right? As I'm a amendmenter or whatever,
right. And so that's a different vector of group
Right.
identity.
Right.
And so that depends on what in your own personal intersectionality, to use the term, um, what is your strongest, identification there? Do you identify more strongly as a pro Second Amendment, or do you identify more strongly as a Trump supporter?
Right.
So,
Right.
and you
Well,
can
like, for
see that.
example, yeah, for myself personally, right? I grew up in an age, well, both of us grew up in an age when I thought that the Democratic Party or the liberal left in America was the working class party, right? I thought
Right.
that's the way I identified myself as working class. I didn't come from a wealthy family, in fact, my parents were really poor when they were kids. Um, and so I identified with that, and that has always been, and it still remains a core part of my personal self identity, right? Of being not economically elite, right? Even though I'm these days, economically fairly comfortable, right? And much more than my parents ever were, and I know during through their lives, certainly as their parents' parent or
Well,
my parents.
I think we're both in a generation where when we went to college, and yeah, for those of you out there, I went to college. Um, when when we went to college, I know it was my experience. I would imagine that you had this too. That a lot of the people that we went to school with were the first generation of their family that were going to college.
Well, yeah, I mean, my parents were the first in their, some of the first in their generation. I mean, they're, um, and yes, that's true. To some, most of a lot of our friends were, especially in the Midwest, and
Yeah.
especially those of us who didn't go to, really expensive Ivy League schools or something.
So
Um,
yeah, I mean, and that was I identify that with kind of that working class background. I mean,
right.
we came from a town where everybody worked for General Motors.
But that's not necessarily the case now, right? I mean, because I talked about the jarring effect of them kind of going against the principles of the Second Amendment recently, the administration. But I felt the same way when it came to the pro corporate stances of Clinton, for example, Bill Clinton when he was president. I saw that as not being aligned with what I thought of as the working class Democratic Party, right? And I think the folks that have left the Democratic Party and have joined up, especially people that joined up with the Tea Party and then followed on with the MAGA movement, is I don't think they see the Democrats as representing the working class.
No, there's a prevailing thought that and this is referenced in the final episode of that documentary series that I sent you, the Century of Self, which I I thought was a great series, um, identifying kind of the evolution of the use of psychology in influence of thought.
Hmm.
But, it ends up with kind of looking at, like, the Clinton campaign, and I believe it was the Blair campaign, whoever was the contemporary of Clinton in the UK at the time. But that's one of the things they recognize that, Dick Morris, I think was largely responsible, but the they made a calculated decision to tack to be more supportive of corporate interests and more aligned with corporate interests versus the working class. And I mean, there's a strong argument to be made that that's where the Democratic Party has remained since that.
So it's interesting because that it's a disconnect, right, between what we say our values are, right, and what ends up becoming the group value dynamic, right, of what the group stands for. Um, and they're not always perfectly aligned. I think sometimes we end up kind of sticking with our group for lack of having a better option, so to
Well,
speak,
it's I
right?
mean, that goes back to my point that I believe that as the group grows, values and principles become much less important. Ideology becomes much less important to the group. What's important to the group is the success and the growth of the group.
Right, right,
So that was, that's part of that series is that it looked at, whether that be corporate interests or political interests or, intelligence community interests or whatever aspect of that that you were looking at, that it adapts to whatever it sees as the climate that people are going to respond to. So, yeah, 20 years ago, this represented this, now it represents that. But, you know, our system two thinking was done whenever we had done our initial calculations on that. So now we just go with the identity. And most people aren't thinking mostly about the fact that, well, this group that I identify with, that I put a lot of support behind, doesn't necessarily represent what it did when I identified with the group.
right, right, yeah. Or at the very least, it's I'm gonna hold my nose and vote for this side because it is just a little bit closer to and the other side's what I would like to see. But it's
Well,
certainly
that's
not representing my direct interest.
yeah, that's where we're accepting. I mean, we're accepting the idea that, it may have varied slightly, but I still believe that this group identity is largely in line with my personal identity. And I'm still, you know, in point of fact, you know, basically accepting the identity of the opposing group as explained to me by um, the group identity that I'm part of, especially if we're not relating a lot to people that are part of that opposing group identity.
Right, right. Yeah. And of course, we've already self-sorted in terms of where we live, right? I mean, for the
Yeah.
most part, I mean, I think a lot of people recognize very readily that the divisions in politics do definitely follow kind of a urban versus rural type of dichotomy, right? And part of that is just self-sorting, is just putting ourselves in circles and in communities that are as like-minded as possible in our sense. And um, that makes it more difficult to come to a more unified national identity, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I mean, we're in a process over the last couple of decades of really siloing ourselves so that we experience less and less of opposing viewpoints. I mean, you mentioned that geographically, and yeah, there's kind of always been a city folk versus country folk kind
Right.
of
Dynamic. Sure.
dynamic, each believing that they're superior to the other. And so that's kind of sorted itself out, and there's less um less cross pollination in there. And then, especially since we've moved to most of our communication being online,
Online. Yeah.
we're really siloing ourselves there to where we're not experiencing any other viewpoints whatsoever.
Right. Right. It's becoming an atomization. Right.
Right. And as a matter of fact, that is supported by the group. And this is what we talked about in our first episode and talked about prior to coming together, is that
Hmm.
that's really promoted from individuals in the group. It's like, how can you even communicate with somebody who would believe something like I'm assuming that they believe, but I don't know because I haven't talked to them about it?
Right. Right. Well, I mean, that's just a follow on, is it not, of what we talked about with Bernays and PR and marketing and advertising. And of course, why wouldn't the algorithms of social media do that, right? Because it's very, very profitable, right? And it's the easiest and best way to manipulate people into behaviors that you want them to perform.
Yeah, I mean, if you can up that anxiety level, if you identify an enemy and identify them as a threat and identify them as an immediate threat, for anyone in a position where they want control, fear is the greatest means of control. I mean, you create an emergency, you declare that emergency, and then you set in place, restrictions and boundaries to be able to mitigate that emergency that you created in the first place.
Right, exactly. So how do
Never
we
let a
how
good
do we
crisis
combat
go to
that?
waste.
I mean, how, because you and I will look at a situation and we'll come up with, I mean, we basically are analyzing the situation from our own identity and group association, right?
Right.
But when you really break it down, and when we actually start to talk about the issue itself, that's where we find more agreement than I think we give ourselves the opportunity to believe in a lot of time, because it's, we find that we're not so different than as we think we are.
So what I what I had jotted down on that earlier today, and it relates back to my trying to look at things through patterns instead
Hmm.
of evaluating the context.
Hmm.
But the statement that I'd come up with is that we need to try to not look at the context of whether this perspective is correct or incorrect. We need to look at the perspective of how does someone believe this, and in what context does this make sense.
right, right. And also, are where can we identify where people are trying to manipulate us?
Yeah, and I mean, you've pushed back on this a little bit, but the conclusion that I came to that I'm operating from at this point is always 100% of the time.
That somebody's trying to manipulate.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I will qualify that to say, if I'm getting information from some kind of group or organization, I mean, the pushback that you've given, which I think is totally valid, is that I don't see these conversations that we're having as being manipulative. We're, you know, we want each other to be able to understand our perspectives, but we collectively together want to be able to evaluate and determine what the truth is in those perspectives. And, where one of us is right, where both of us are right, where neither of us is right.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the key, right? The key is to put at the top of your value priority list truth, right?
Right. But if I see a report on something that happened that I wasn't there for, um, see a post on social media, whatever, I run that through the filter of how is this trying to manipulate me?
Right, right. Yeah. And I think that the first question we have to ask always is, well, who's going to benefit from this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Leaning leaning in one direction or another, right?
Well, and I think the trap that people fall into with that, um, because this is another one of those magic words that we had talked about before, the conspiracy theory. Um, when something is identified as conspiracy theory, that flips a switch, and for a lot of people, it's like I don't have to take that seriously because that's just wacko thinking. Um, but the conspiracy theory, the way that gets implied is kind of implying the idea that if you say that this is an effort to manipulate, people interpret that to mean as there is a small cabal that is using everything to try to manipulate and not thinking about the fact that every individual group is using the same psychological principles to try to manipulate your thinking. It's not one group trying to manipulate your thinking in one way.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, the challenge is being able to have a conversation like this where we're not seeing the agreement or where we can find agreement as weakening our membership in our own group, right? I mean, we trying to see these in a non-threatening way, these differences in a non-threatening way, right? Um, that seems to me to be one of the biggest challenges that we run into when we're trying to talk about these things online or when we're trying to talk about these things with people that disagree with us. Is being able to stop ourselves from being threatened by the conversation.
Yeah, I look at, I continually go back to that first AI conversation that you posted on, the AI analysis of, a hypothetical disagreement on a topic to where the division stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of what both parties thought was the shared understanding.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I mean that applies to what we were talking about on our own personal group identities too. We assume that the people that we share a group identity with see things the same way that we do, where sometimes those assumptions are not correct.
Right, right. Well, maybe that's a next kind of point where we can start to head in our conversations is to start to identify some of those conceptions and misconceptions, right? And maybe start to challenge. those assumptions. Um, Maybe that's where this is heading. What do you think?
Okay, yep,
I
that
mean,
sounds like
because
a
I think that
possibility.
we've been doing this now for six episodes, and I think we're starting to see that we have a framework, right? We have a general idea of how to approach these different topics, these different issues. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think this is going to be driving a lot of my thinking for our conversations, is that whatever happens in the next few years of the current presidential administration or the current government, whether or not the power structure changes in the next year or not or whatever, but in the end, we still have the basic question of what kind of a world do we want to live in, right? And what kind of a society do we want to live in? And how can we best find ways uh, to find levels of agreement that allow us to move forward in ways that are more productive than what we've been doing up until now?
Well, I in that context, I think one of the things, I'm big into the idea of reframing things and trying to look at things from a different context. So I think that one of the things that we need to look at on that is to challenge the assumption of what is it that we need to do to be able to affect change. Because especially in the political conversation, the focus on that is, well, if if we just get the right people in Congress, if we just get the right president, we can make this change. And what nobody thinks about, but when it's called into question, everybody will acknowledge is your mayor and your city council have a lot more direct impact on your life than
Absolutely.
what the president does.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I was listening to the I don't know what they call him, president or chairman or whatever of the council of mayors, right? And he
Hmm.
happens to be a Republican, I think, out of Oklahoma. But he was interviewed yesterday, and he was saying exactly that. That at the local level, we work together with across parties much better in a lot of ways. I mean, I was in local government for 8 years, and I saw a lot of changes there and a lot of bipartisanship. I mean, in fact, I think we had more votes that were basically by unanimous consent than we had that were split by one or two votes, right? Um, and so it's interesting that there are at the local level real there are real bipartisan efforts, real agreement being had at a local level because it's directly affects their everyday lives. People just can't be at each other's throats 24/7, right?
Yeah,
And be able to live.
the first thing that they're doing in that instance is not applying that political partisan group identity dynamic when they're evaluating what's going on there. And again, it's an organization that's within Dunbar's number. So you have, the personal identification of the individual in that, as opposed to only seeing someone through that group identity lens.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, that idea was around long before Dunbar too. I mean, even Plato, that was his chief um, complaint about democracy as a failed, as a fallible system is that it needs to be a small group. Once you get too big, it's unmanageable. Um,
Well, I mean,
so it'll be interesting to see how we can address and apply these things at a national level more closely to the way that we approach things at a local level.
yeah, I mean, ideally, it would be great if we could prioritize the local and worry less about the national. But I mean, this is a structure that goes back to Exodus.
Right. Right.
It was the structure of judges that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, gave to Moses at that point in that story. And it was,
Hmm.
you handle things at the lowest level possible if that's not possible, you kick it up a level. I
Pick it
mean,
up a
it's the
level.
same structure that our court system is based on.
Right, right. Yeah,
But
and, but I mean, what we've ended up with, I think, is a system that's far more top down,
yeah, yeah,
and
we've
perhaps that's what
inverted the
people are fighting,
process.
pushing back against. So, and that's something that I think we'll have to address as well, just to try to understand, well, how do we do that? How do we make that happen? And part of that is just having these conversations.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, pat ourselves on the back maybe a little too much or whatever, but I feel like that modeling doing this is, an important step in trying to, what we can do to try to address this.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And on that note, um, maybe we'll wrap this up and then push on in our conversations. Uh, we have our launch coming up, and that's going to be exciting to see get things out there. And want to thank all of the listeners and viewers for sticking with us through this. And we're going to be really looking forward to getting that feedback and seeing how people respond to
Yep, we really appreciate both of you.
it.
But yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
by the next time we come together, we'll have some public feedback on this and see what people are saying. So I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you have a great week, and let's keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. Talk to you next week.